looking forward to the weekend. My name is Emma Brooks. I'm Head of Marketing here at E2E Assure alongside Dominic Carroll, Director of Portfolio, and our CEO and founder, Rob Demain, who will be walking you guys through today's session, Logging with Precision, Optimising Costs. This is a particular topic that we've seen of interest loads throughout the industry at the moment, so I hope you get some really, really valuable conversation throughout the presentation. We do have the Q&A box available. If you have any questions throughout the session, please put them in there. We've got a Q&A session at the end, so we'll be running through any questions that you raise. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Dom and Rob, over to you.
Thank you, Emma. So just a bit of an outline of how the session is going to run. So we're going to look at some of the challenges, as security leaders, what are those budget challenges that you're facing? Look at a bit of a brief history of logging and analytics, where it's come from, where it is today, and towards the end we'll do a bit of this kind of future gazing of where that might be heading, and then how you kind of use effective logging and analytics to kind of bring down your risk profile, what's involved. We'll get into some of the details and kind of really dig into what your options are for making sure that your business is well protected, but it's not kind of costing you more than it should, and you can kind of effectively kind of fend off the numerous threat actors out there. Let's start off with a bit of a background with ourselves. So Rob, over to you. You're going to tell us a bit about your history and how you come to where we are today.
Thanks, Dom. Yeah, so I founded E2E Assure about 12 years ago, and we're a focused specialist SOC and MDR business. And my background's always been in SOC and MDR. So I guess looking back 15, 20 years, I've always been in the industry, focused on detection and response. And at E2E, we kind of have a few things. We have a 24/7 SOC, and also we use our own software and integrate that with other bits of software in order to try and do the best job we can, put it that way. And that often involves taking a lot of logs.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, myself. So I've been working in tech for far too long, over 30 years, but doing kind of product development, service development for kind of past 16 years, and the last 10 of those have been in pure play cybersecurity. So built a few platforms to take to market, but main focus has been on managed services, managed detection response in particular over the last kind of 7 years. And there's been a few interesting kind of experiments and innovation cycles of building platforms, seeing what you can do with open source tools, and kind of really got into the depth of and details of how to, the challenges that you face when you're trying to ingest and analyze lots and lots of data, but doing so in a way that kind of makes business sense and kind of cost in. So we're going to look at some of that in a bit more detail now. So to start with, the cyber budget conundrum. So there's looking at this slide, things look a bit one-sided. So on the left, typical, kind of average numbers around the cybersecurity budget, but it tends to kind of boil down to about 1% of a company's revenue. And on the flip side, you've got cyber criminals looking at your business, probably thinking, typically estimates around between 2 and 4% of your company revenue. They'll start off with a ransomware negotiation. But obviously you don't want to be paying that. But either way, there are cleanup costs, depending on how far they get in. Now, obviously there's different stages of an attack, and there's different ways you can stop them. Obviously, the sooner you can kind of detect and contain them, the better, because that costs you less. But to get to that stage where you kind of have your detections, analytics, and working really, really well, you need to kind of do a lot of ingestion and tuning, and that's where the costs can ramp up. So Rob, I just wondered if there's anything there that kind of spoke to you in particular, anything you kind of wanted to call out, things we've been seeing over the last couple of years in the industry.
Yeah, sure. I think the kind of conundrum is that the SOC people, we want all the logs, all the data to do a good job. And if there's an instant response activity needed, they also want all the logs. But it's really quite hard to justify that up front when it's quite an expensive thing to do. So it's often when you have an incident that you realize you wanted all these things. And I think the little bit at the bottom is really important. That's to do with the speed of detection and response. To do a good job at catching them early, is obviously key, because that reduces the cost of any actual attack or breach. But I think to do a good job, you've got to get the balance right between the right amount of logs and not spending too much. And I guess that's the conundrum, isn't it?
It is. And obviously one of the costs in the kind of overall budget there, I've got as a cyber insurance, and that's kind of an interesting theme because obviously an insurer will kind of want you to demonstrate that you've got great policies, that you kind of got good monitoring in place, and that your user awareness training, all that is kind of where it should be, because that reduces the likelihood. And they use these financial terms for managing risk of annual rate of occurrence and single loss expectancy. So the more mature and more effective your cyber operations are, the less likely it's going to happen frequently. So that's the annual rate of occurrence, and then the single loss expectancy is how much it might cost every time it happens. So that's that view there at the bottom of why there's such a variance between breach cleanup costs. So industry estimates between 5% and 25% of revenue, and that's a huge kind of range. But that's because if you catch them early, it's still classed as a breach incident. You still got to go through the incident response process, but you don't have to kind of rebuild your business from the ground up or your kind of digital infrastructure. Whereas if the attacker gets all the way through, so if they get past initial infrastructure, they get they use their living on the land techniques to kind of get move around and do privilege escalation, exfiltrate your data, and then ransomware it. The cleanup of that there's not many insurance policies in the world which will cover all those costs. And if you're at 25% of revenue, and if you're a £100 million business, keep the numbers simple, that's 25 million just to kind of get your business back to where it was in a safe and stable place. So the ransomware amount kind of pales into insignificance against that. Well, it's not insignificant, but it's a lot smaller. So your 1% of your revenue to kind of avoid that happening, reduce the likelihood, reduce the kind of single loss expected annual rate of occurrence. If you can get that right, that kind of pays back numerous 25-fold potentially. So it's really kind of got to understand that. But the challenge is to get to that level of detection fidelity, as Rob says. We kind of need all those logs. We need to be looking kind of across the whole digital infrastructure to spot signals. Traditionally, that's been done using what is known as a SIEM, Security Information and Event Management Platform. We're going to talk a bit about that. So here's a kind of a typical example, and I've used some kind of standard pricing from in this case, from Microsoft Sentinel. That if you've got a 500 user organization and you're kind of looking at logins, the authorizations, what the endpoint's doing, cloud environment, pulling in logs from firewall servers, lots of external stuff, probably going to generate about 200 gig a day, and the kind of price book consumption cost for that is £185,000 a year before you start putting analysts and 24/7 and everything else around it. So you want to make sure you're kind of getting your best value for that. But yeah, I guess the flip side is, historically, maybe 8 years ago, to get a SIEM in place was a really big kind of long drawn out project. Now, Rob, I know you've done a few of these before you kind of started E2E Ashore. Is there anything you want to kind of share the experiences you had about how much cost and time went into that?
Yeah, deploying kit into data centers and deploying various other bits of tech and boxes and like that is a slow and tedious job potentially. And enabling something like Sentinel or Cloud SIEM is obviously really easy to begin with. So I think in the early stages of a Cloud SIEM deployment versus legacy, it seems like a lot easier. But then you still get dragged into the same challenges getting data to the SIEM. And I think there's extra challenges organizations face when the SIEM's in the cloud, which is bandwidth and getting data through it and latency. And what happens if the internet is disconnected as part of the incident and you could lose your Cloud SIEM collection? So I think the move to Cloud SIEM is brilliant, and it's made it much more accessible, easy to use, and we've really advanced in technology. But I think there are some more conundrums that people should consider when deploying it.
Yeah, Doug, obviously the benefits for speed, yes, getting speed and visibility, and kind of familiarity of interface for analysts who are used to using the Microsoft stack. It's hard to kind of knock that, but yeah, it's not a throw it all in and forget it. It can quickly spiral out of control. So let's look at some of that in a bit more kind of detail. So in terms of that cloud business model, obviously, when you have a kind of a cloud platform, it's built up of lots of other individual cloud services, and obviously that cloud, it's there to generate profit and growth for the cloud provider. That's something we all understand, and we all get value out of that in terms of not having massive upfront expenses and kind of things becoming easier over time. But they are, of course, designed for the mass market as a whole, and the kind of the technical components involved are not necessarily there a means to an end. Each of them is its own business case in its own right. Whereas, if you look at kind of building your own solution, or to an MSSP like ourselves that has a platform, when we're kind of building that platform infrastructure, it's not there to kind of generate costs in and of itself. It's there to elevate the capability of the SOC analysts, and we just write that cost off. What we call depreciation amortization, without looking to make money off it. It's there to, the way a business model like ours works is to kind of, it's about getting the money back from effective detection and response early as possible in the attacker lifecycle. So, and obviously it enables, allows for a lot more flexibility and customization as well. So, people, in terms of building these out, you're not kind of limited to a fixed workflow or a fixed set of components. Things can quite easily be tailored. Rob, anything you kind of want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally, it's the kind of data consumption model, pay as you go data consumption, the cloud model that's really attractive on a small scale. And I think as it scales up, people have to really consider how you're going to make that work, because it's never going to be the cheapest way of doing it. It's not really the driver. They're not saying it's going to be the most cost effective. So when you're building out projects with cloud SIEMs, you really got to plan in advance and have to be fully aware of the kind of data consumption and the volumes of that data, what the options are for keeping tabs on it and keeping an eye on the bill.
Yes, it's an interesting point, that, because, as you say, cloud works it's great for small businesses and kind of startups, everything else. It kind of enables them to move fast. For very large organizations, the economics start to kind of not look so great. And that's the thing about, I guess, security logging. Most companies, when they start doing that to an effective level where they get really high fidelity detection, the amount of logs required potentially is kind of disproportionate to that kind of the business's size. We're talking hundreds of gigs of logs per day, just from a kind of medium-sized business. And that, from a data analytics perspective, it's probably much more than they're doing for any of their kind of business intelligence insights. So that security log analytics requirement is huge. So just going to look at that in a bit more detail. So why, the analytics part, if you're kind of used to dealing with, like, the cloud platforms, you generally have different tiers of kind of log ingest you can have, and obviously you notice that the analytics part of that is very expensive and costs a lot of money. Rob, do you want to kind of add some commentary to what's on the slide?
There's a good reason, if you're putting data into a cloud seems like it'll be cheap and cost effective, and that is the case. But when you're doing a SIEM workload, there's quite a lot of other demands on the data, and depending on how quickly you're running your rules, over what time periods, all of the variables means that ultimately you're using high performance compute for that task. So the cloud provider has to provide quite a lot of resources, cluster resources as well, typically across geo regions. So it is an expensive thing to deliver in the cloud. And as Dom said, the volumes here, the events per second or the transactions per second, are really, really quite significant, and often they outweigh that of the rest of the organization's applications, even for things like online banking. Where they have high transaction rates for the major banks. It's nothing compared to log volume rates. I think we are in an area here where people don't realize just how much data is being produced these days. And to answer that, the cloud providers and anyone who's providing a SIEM needs to provide a lot of decent compute these days. I think as we start to add AI and things like that to the stack, it's only going to get more demanding.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Obviously, we could talk about AI and what's happening there, but machine learning and obviously parts of AI add a lot of great functionality to kind of any threat detection analytics platform. But the costs of that, I'm not just talking about training, but just the inference costs of running against that amount of data, and obviously the kind of the continual operation around keeping those machine learning models tuned. It's just, that adds a whole new layer. And again, if you're kind of running a infrastructure business, making sure that you're kind of generating a profit off your machine learning capability, that's another kind of XPM. It can multiply that cost quite quickly when you're running that across an amount of data that you'd not kind of known was going to come in the first place. But there you go. It's not all doom and gloom. There's plenty of things you can do. There's lots of ways you can kind of tune and segment the different log sources and types coming in and what to do with them. And Rob, I know you spend a lot of time with this over the years, but there's different options. Some of them work well. There are pros and cons, and this is where we get into understanding what the different log sources are, what the fields are within those logs that are really important for security, and which ones are not. And the different SIEM platforms, cloud providers, others kind of give some guidance around that. But still, you kind of, if you kind of get that wrong, you're paying a lot for storage that you don't necessarily need. So, kind of going through this bit like one at a time, data sampling, Rob. I mean, how effective do you think that is as a strategy?
Yeah, in its place, it's quite effective, and generally the recommendation is to use the sources of the logs to do that sampling. So people sending the sources of NetFlow, routers and switches and firewalls, they can use sampling, which basically says, rather than send you every one of these, I'm going to say that I've had 15 of these and they're all the same through this period. And that works quite well with things like firewall logs, potentially, when you've got lots and lots of repeat logs. Firewall accepts, things like that. It's very, very repetitive. So summarizing them at source and sending that summarized message to the SIEM is a feature that some of these end tools like firewalls and routers and switches support. So that's worth looking at, although it isn't every single log being logged, if that makes sense. It's sending you a statistical message about what's being logged. So forensically, it's questionable. So that may be a problem, and it may not. And then with filtering, obviously, you're making a choice of what you're going to send through to the end SIEM. You can do that at the source as well, which is always the preferred way. And basically saying in your group policies, don't send these Windows event IDs to the SIEM, or in your login policy for syslog for your tools, don't send these types of logs. That can be great, but again, it's very, very hard to maintain and manage that stuff, and it's often done and then forgotten about. And with cybersecurity, you've always got to think about what you might not have thought about. So back in the day, when we used to do sort of firewall logs and IDS, we used to have these spreadsheets of which firewall IDS rule we'd want to be, alerted on and all that. And we'd spend every week reviewing the latest IDS rules to see if there are ones we wanted to be alerted on. And that can be a very, very time-consuming thing. And sometimes you'd make a decision based on today's knowledge that becomes a bad decision in the future because a certain attack used a new technique and you weren't logging that because you didn't think it was worth it. So event filtering can be a challenge. It can be effective. You definitely should look at the top sources of your logs in your SIEM and work out what they are and if they could be filtered. Because if it's it's always a conundrum, though, isn't it? Because you could say application logs aren't important, but actually they might be really important in an incident. So it's not an easy solution, unfortunately.
That's something that's cropped to mind as you were saying that. So obviously you've got indicators of compromise coming through from your threat intel feeds to say certain logs and certain event fields and log fields are really important now, and you kind of you've tried to automate that, and then all of a sudden you're ingesting 10 times more than you were before because it's necessary for these new feeds. Is that potentially a problem going forward as people try to automate?
It's really hard to budget looking forward because you don't know what logs you should really need. Mm-hmm. No one really gets it right to begin with. We could all estimate volumes, EPS and things like that until someone turns on debug on a firewall for a weekend and goes on holiday. And you get a massive burst of firewall logs. And then there might be an incident report you'll read that says, you should be logging this. And you might go and then turn that on, but you didn't think about that a year ago when you sort of bought the thing. So I guess, you need flexibility and scalability, which is a great thing about things like cloud SIEMs. They have that flexibility. It's just that's going to cost you more. It might be an unexpected cost due to some reason that might be beyond your control. It may be a group policy change that's gone wrong or something, and all of a sudden you get a log storm. And that happens all the time.
Log storm. That sounds terrifying.
Yeah. So the other sort of techniques, as the compression, and is obviously sort of a good way of archiving data and compressing it and using that type of technique. Again, everything's going to cost you more compute, versus storage. So when you're looking at compression aggregation, you're kind of deciding if you'd rather wait a bit longer to see stuff and cost more CPU to get it, or you'd rather save more disk space. And that'll kind of depend on what tier of storage you've stored it in, and what the price for that tier is. But generally, with that retention policy bit at the bottom, compression aggregation kind of goes hand in hand, where organizations are making choices around how much data they want to keep in live, if you like, accessible, versus kind of nearly accessible in slower time, and then on a shelf, zipped up and compressed in a storage blob or an AWS bucket for retrieval later. And I guess it kind of depends on how timely you want to be able to search that data. If it's kind of seconds and minutes that you need to have it in live storage or hot storage, if you can wait a few hours, it might be going to different levels of storage. If it's a few days, again, you might be able to put it in other bits of storage. And then the aggregation piece is that hopefully you've got a view of what the general data kind of looks like on a volumetric perspective, which gives you the ability to understand that your aggregate data looks correct. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I just think back to the previous conversation about why security analytics are expensive. So again, that makes that really difficult, doesn't it? Because some things, what do you need to be able to analyze in milliseconds and seconds, and what do you want to run, anomaly detection against? That all has to be live data. But you don't, when new information and new intel comes through, you don't necessarily, you might have to then pull that back in. And obviously, if you pull in data from like cold storage or archive storage back into live storage, obviously in a cloud platform, you're paying for re-ingesting that again, what we call rehydration. So that's something you also you might not have thought of. So, and that kind of comes back to part of your kind of cleanup costs as well. If you need to kind of re-ingest all your old data so you can kind of reanalyze it, that's another thing to consider. But I guess on that storage retention logging piece, there's some obviously new cool kids on the block, and there's far too many to kind of put on one slide for a game of bingo. But I mean, here's some of the kind of common names, but new approaches, new ways of doing this. I'll speak to kind of agentic pipelines in a bit. It's agentic everything in the world at the moment, obviously, and people obviously looking at how these agents could be used to automatically normalize and decide what fields to ingest from unstructured data in a lake. But that sounds scary in terms of cost management. But obviously, there's people looking at that and experimenting with that. But what are your thoughts on some of? I mean, Cribble. We obviously people talk about a lot as a way to filter or automatically, but it also has its own costs associated with it. So, are you just shifting costs? Does it solve a problem? What are your thoughts there, Rob?
Yeah, I think it's obviously evidence there is a problem in the way we're doing it. I think that's probably most conversations we're having. There's definitely a cost discussion on data storage and how they can optimize it, and that's when other solutions like this start to become attractive. I mean, there's different use cases for all these. I'll just try and touch on one of them as a good example. If you're a big organization, you might already have lots and lots of logs in AWS, and the traditional SIEM model will say, okay, ship them all to your new SIEM. You're effectively paying twice. So there may be a cost argument to say enable AWS Security Lake and integrate your SIEM with that. Does that kind of make sense? And that having the SIEM understand what's in the data lake without having to drag the data out of it. So making that queryable is also a massive cost saving potentially, isn't it? So these solutions all work at scale. And again, it's probably not for a small organization because the overhead and the extra cost and complexity you're adding. Because all this stuff adds complexity. The more things you put into a detection chain, the more likely is something's going to go wrong. So you need more people to make sure it doesn't go wrong operationally. Like SOCs need to make sure the data is arriving, and it's always going to be arriving, and it's where they expect it to be in the format they need it. So great to see all these innovations, but again, just got to be aware that it's all going to take more maintenance potentially.
And again, back to the conundrum. Obviously, there's technology solutions that might kind of deal with some of the technology issues, but obviously the newer technologies required, expertise and tuning of people to understand it. And for a lot of businesses, having that continual process doesn't make sense. It's kind of more of a one kind of they might see that as a project-based approach, and then the kind of who's going to do the kind of the feeding and watering and making sure everything's up to speed, because that can be if you're not in that day in, day out. So you're not much fit around that. It's kind of it's a skill you need to stay on top of. Okay, so let's. Obviously, we'll be keeping an eye on that. Obviously, we kind of look at what we can use for our platform. But in terms of the way things we do at the moment, and kind of what's the best of both worlds. So, so we get obviously one of our kind of key parts of our proposition is we have lots of integrations into tools and platforms that our clients have already integrated into. So they can continue to use the asset and sweat the asset, but obviously we also have our own platform. And that kind of affords the availability to then choose which logs and telemetry and data is best kind of stored initially, within the cloud platform. And that typically be kind of cloud native logs and telemetry if you've got like an E5 blast on Microsoft, for example, versus things that you don't really want to kind of be paying massive amounts of consumption charges for, which, kind of you might need for instant response or compliance purposes, but not necessarily good security data. So there's a good balance to be had around that. Rob, can I get your kind of insight and expertise on a bit of that?
Yeah, I'll just sort of take you back in time, I guess. So sort of previously to Assure, my main business was putting in SIEMs, all types of SIEMs, different types of SIEMs, some of which are still around, some of which are kind of disappeared now. And we'd always have this kind of problem over how much data we could bring into it, if you like, because the main job we were doing was building a SOC, and as part of building a SOC, we were selecting a SIEM, and you can chop and change your SIEM all you like. But what I learned after a major deployment many years ago, we put a SIEM in place, we put in an ancient version of SharePoint for case management and a bit of integration. And then we found that all the analysts had built something separate they were using a year later because they wanted to have network traffic analysis, and that wasn't in the scope of the SIEM project. So when we started E2E Assure, we also started making a platform that did 80% of it, to make sure that our analysts were capable and had the data to hand to do their job. And as we became a managed service business, we found that more and more customers are making decisions around what the logging, what the monitoring, and asking us to monitor that. That creates a risk for a business like ours, and we don't have the visibility and coverage that we need to do a good job. Here a typical example would be: we put a SIEM in, we put the firewall logs in it. Can you please do a SOC service? And you've got some firewall logs only. It's very limiting, isn't it, to detect a piece of ransomware initial access if you're looking at firewall logs.
Yeah.
So that's our kind of view on the world, is we need to sort of self-insure this a bit, because we can't really offer a service based on some firewall logs that's a true SOC service, but it just doesn't have the visibility into identity, into network, into cloud, into Active Directory and everything else that you need to be able to understand compromises in process. And I guess we've learned those lessons the hard way. But we also recognize how great cloud SIEMs are and what advantages they bring, and how good it is to see that teams can get in control of that tech and they can deploy it and build SOCs. But in our kind of view of the world, this kind of hybrid best of both fits quite neatly, making sure a customer can stay within their platform of choice and almost make the rest turnkey. Because what you don't want to do is keep adding operational overhead. So your SOC team is more of an IT team managing SOC, SIEMs, data lakes, and parsing tools and AI. That they spend more of their time playing with the tools functionally and not doing the operational job of detecting and responding to cyber attacks. So there's a real risk, isn't there, that people wander off into, my job as a SOC analyst is managing the SIEM, not writing detections and responses. So I guess the way this approach for us means that we can jointly focus on detecting and responding to cyber attacks, and not playing with the latest tech and changing things around just because it's new or just because it seems better. Because the cost of implementation, the time it takes to train, the time it takes to do stuff, is all time you're taking away from your frontline analysts who should be looking at those alerts and writing detections.
Yeah, that's a really great point. It can become the tail wagging the dog if you're not careful, because the tech's supposed to be there to kind of make the analyst more effective. But if the analyst is spending more of their time trying to make the tech more effective, it's not done what it's supposed to do. So I mean, I guess that kind of speaks to this point as well. So for me, if you modern SOC, whether it's us providing it or whoever's providing it, the architecture should be around the operations, the outcomes, the benefits you're getting. It's not the tech should sit underneath and should be kind of transparent. So having really everything geared towards early detection and containment to drive down that cost, as we talked about in the beginning, of any kind of things that do need a clean up. That's got to be kind of outcome kind of North Star vision number one. And the different data sources and telemetry sources you're bringing in, they need to be clear on what the outcomes intended for that. What kind of threats are you trying to detect? What how might that be used in an attack campaign? The intelligent automation, obviously, lots and lots of hype and noise, but also some really kind of good concepts out there at the moment. But it always needs to be kind of making the analysts more effective, and not, as you kind of just really well articulated, Rob, kind of something that's going to distract the analyst away from doing what they're really, really good at, which is the kind of human intuitive side of putting things together. And also to be able to test and validate this quite easy is really key, and making what you've got is working. And obviously we talk about logs being making sure you're choosing and optimizing the right logs, but how do you know getting so kind of going back, testing and your alerts, your detections, your containment? Do you have the right log sources? Are there anything in those log sources that's surplus to requirements? That's it's another good opportunity to tune that based on. We thought these log sources were necessary to detect a certain kind of living off the land attack. It turns out it's not. We kind of can kind of tune things down a bit for what we think is our current threat profile. So things are going to continue to move fast. Lots of technological innovations out there, but making sure you can kind of balance the costs of those in the right way, to kind of have the desired outcome of detecting and containing things as early as possible to drive down your risk position. That's going to close that down from my side. Rob, anything else you want to close off with on that point before we open up the Q&A?
I think that's a good summary. I mean, it's a hard sort of place to be at the moment, with cyber attacks, because it's not easy to say to customers, this is the one thing you need to do, one type of log you need to be doing. It's a moving feast. So I guess that's a challenge, and people need to understand that if they're doing a SOC or a SIEM project, it's a forever project. It's not something that sort of starts and ends on a date. You're never going to stop feeding water in your SIEM. You're never going to stop messing with data sources and tuning and doing all that stuff. It's an ongoing job. I think Emma's going to introduce a Q&A. But I was just saying that the comment from Cecil, I think it's Cecil who's come in, is that's kind of a really good question, because it's what I'm talking about is there's lots and lots of management overhead you might not be expecting. A lot of the time we enable things, it looks like it's working, maybe it isn't. So I guess the sort of enabling a cloud SIEM, the stuff out of the box that connects to other cloud connectors that are in the same cloud work really well, but trying to get other stuff working can take a lot more time than you expect. And then there is the egress fees. So what happens if you wanted to move the data out, perhaps to a new SIEM that pops up or something else, or a new service? Then there may be egress fees that you need to be charged. You might have a huge ton of data you need to move out of that SIEM. And if that's in the cloud, that may be very costly. That's something to consider. And I know a lot of organizations probably think that's not going to happen, but it really does depend on organizational strategy. Organization may suddenly be acquired by someone who uses Google Cloud Platform, and it's all sitting in Microsoft. So you don't know what's going to happen. I'm just sort of saying there are other costs such as egress, but ultimately I think that you'll find that there's a lot more overhead and management needed than people expect.
Thank you very much, Rob. We have had a couple of other questions that have come through as well. And I don't believe that all attendees will be able to see all of the questions that come through. So in case you couldn't see what Cecil's question was there, it was what are some of the overlooked costs associated with cloud services such as data egress fees that can impact total cost of ownership? So thank you very much for that, Rob. We have had a couple of other ones come through as well. So thank you so much for everybody who has input questions into the Q&A. One that's come up, which I think, apologies. One thing that's come up that I think ties into that question really nicely is what are the actual savings looking like when you're putting this kind of strategy in place?
So yeah, do you want to pick that up, Robin? I was going to kind of, so it's the savings really kick in the kind of the bigger you scale, and typically kind of the 150 to 200 gig a day ingest upwards. That's when you kind of see the biggest amounts that can then start from like 60% of your consumption costs And we've seen savings at the bigger end, like 81% plus. Rob, is there anything you want to?
No, I think that's probably the record so far is 81. And that's just, it's going to take time to get to that position with a sort of hybrid solution we're using, Cloud SIEM plus something else. But ultimately, I think, we've got to get the balance right. There's many things you can be doing within the existing SIEM tool to save cost and the way you design it and orchestrate it. But as Dom says, once you get to a certain scale, the amount of moving parts that create uncertainty in your data log rates. I mean, like I say, if you've got a big enterprise, complicated business, you're not going to really be in control of the volume because the sources that are sending it are in control of the volume, not the SIEM. That's the thing to kind of remember. So having a plan from day one, how you're going to understand how you're going to bring the cost savings in is essential. And that gives you the best of both, because then you can have good detections, good threat hunting, good retention periods, and not a ridiculous bill.
Great, thank you so much. And another question that's come through, which links back to what you were just talking about a moment ago, Rob, with overall logging strategy. How do you measure the effectiveness of a logging strategy over time?
Yeah, unfortunately, you need to test it. So that's the kind of thing. So you can obviously measure your cost reduction, which is interesting, but you need to make sure you've not blindsided yourself to cyber attacks. So it's easy to reduce costs by turning off lots of logs, but then your detection drops. So you've got to have two metrics. Your detection, what's the word for it? Dom will know. The viability of your detection strategy is a word for it. Basically, you can easily blindside yourself by turning off logs to save money and go, oh, really? I didn't realize that was a bad idea. So really the ideal scenario there, and we work with several of the little vendors who help us with this, is to do some testing. So testing needs to make sure that the right logs are still coming in. So you need to know what your fundamental log coverage should look like to provide a good SOC service. And then attack testing is the best way, using MITRE techniques and TTPs, but also using latest IOCs to make sure you're getting telemetry back that detects things. So basically the best scenario is you running simulated attacks, breach attack simulation or something to stimulate typical devices to then look what comes through to the SIEM, because that'll test the end-to-end bit, which is it's not just about logs, it's about what rules and use cases you've made. And if you haven't got detection for it, what's the point in having the log? There's kind of an argument there when you're trying to write a detection, what we're going to do with this log. And the kind of best way, well, a good way of doing it is to practice incidents and attacks.
And how often do you reckon that sort of testing strategy should look like? Is that like a quarterly thing, 6 months?
Depends on your resources and your threat level, I'd say. If you've got a simple environment, it's not too big, then I'd do it once a quarter. But if you're a large organization where you've got a lot of moving parts, I'll try and get something in place that's at least got a baseline check running pretty regularly. And you can do that with sort of volumetrics, as I said before, the kind of aggregation check. We're getting normal levels of logs roughly for this period. But ultimately, if you can do a simulation that touches most MITRE techniques available for that particular sort of thing you're touching it on, then you can expect to see the signals back, and you can automate a lot of that. And then there can be a SOC check to make sure that the signals were detected. And you can do that without generating SOC noise. So you can basically have these rules written specifically, so they're just basically telemetry almost. And that's a real mature way of doing things, because it's making sure the end-to-end's working. Do you know what I mean? You're not just getting the logs, but there is a detection, it has fired, and it has done something. And ideally, if you're a mature organization, you should probably have a few test devices that are constantly hooked up to this in the same group policy with some test accounts, so you can do some testing.
Great, thank you so much. And then the final question that we've had come through, again, linking to overall log strategy, is, are there any major trends that you're seeing at the moment that you think will influence logging strategy over the next 3 to 5 years?
One for you, Dom.
Yeah, but I guess back to what we talked about, the future logging and storage direction. People are looking for intermediaries, way of kind of minimizing consumption costs. But yeah, I mean, I think people are trying to automate a lot of that as well, to kind of go out and scour and kind of automatically understand indicators of compromise in more detail, map out attack paths and say, I need this log, this field, and kind of build a kind of an ingestion strategy and kind of map it against what's in a kind of security lake, but that's all kind of very theoretical at the moment. What we're seeing in the kind of near term, in the now term, is kind of intermediaries for picking up, doing the streaming part, filtering out at kind of much lower cost, and then sending that on to a platform that's kind of probably fulfills, a cloud platform fulfills 80% of the kind of junior analyst needs in terms of keeping an eye on what's happening with the business. And maybe other parts will be the kind of senior analysts will look in things in a lot more detail. But yeah, there's lots of automation, lots of innovation happening around the kind of the data storage and what I'd call federated searching as well. So rather than having to put all the data in one central place, you can run analytics over it. There's a lot more now happening in terms of having really smart analytics that can go out and search data in situ and then report back. So that will kind of, I think, will be a theme as well, which will it will be intended to save costs on ingestion, but also it has an element of keeping data, stopping shipping so much kind of log data around and keeping data secure in one place where it can be kind of analyzed for security information as well as other business intelligence.
Great, thank you so much, Dom. That's everything we have now for Q&A. Am I right in thinking you've got a few more slides, or is that the end of this session?
That is the end of the session.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much for your time, everybody. I think that is almost spot on 45 minutes. So beautiful job, Dom and Rob. Thank you, guys. And thank you very much to everybody who has engaged and contributed questions to this session as well. These sessions are always more interesting when we hear what you guys want to hear and want to get involved in. We'll leave it there. If you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out to E2E Assure. Our website is e2eassure.com. We're on LinkedIn as well. Feel free to reach out to myself, Dom, or Rob across LinkedIn, and also contact us via email. It's been fantastic to have you. Hopefully we will see you again in the future.